The knighthood arrived in June of 2009. Sir Howard Morrison, the title he had been waiting for, one way or another, for 60 years of work. The ceremony was dignified. The tributes were warm. The photographs showed a man in his 73rd year accepting the honor with the same generous, encompassing smile that had made New Zealand fall in love with him before most of the people in that room were born. It was, by every official measure, a moment of national celebration. The country was honoring one of its own. The debt was being acknowledged. The account at last was being settled. Howard Morrison died 3 months later. He had suffered a stroke 2 years earlier, in 2007, and the knighthood had come while he was still managing its aftermath, still fighting, with the stubbornness that had characterized his entire career, to remain present, to remain visible, to remain the entertainer his country needed him to be. The title arrived in the final act of a life that had been, in ways the official tributes carefully avoided examining, a story of extraordinary talent running headlong into the particular resistances that New Zealand reserved for its Maori citizens, however celebrated. It arrived just in time to be included in his obituaries. And the question that his death left hanging in the air above the ceremonies of mourning, the question that the eulogies were too kind or too careful to ask directly, was whether a knighthood granted 3 months before a man dies is a recognition or a consolation prize. Howard Clarence Morrison was born on the 18th of August, 1935, in Rotorua, the geothermal city on the North Island's volcanic plateau, the city of hot springs and thermal pools, and the dense, living presence of Te Arawa, the great iwi whose ancestral territory it had always been. He was a child of that place in the deepest sense, not merely born there, but formed by it, shaped by the particular combination of Maori cultural richness and colonial social pressure that characterized the North Island communities of the 1930s and 40s. His father's family carried the musical tradition that would eventually produce one of the most distinctive voices in New Zealand's history. His early years were full of singing, at home, at community gatherings, at the tangi and the hui that were the living tissue of Maori social life in Rotorua.
The New Zealand that Howard Morrison grew up in was a country that had not yet decided what to do with its Maori citizens. The official narrative of biculturalism, the idea that New Zealand was a nation built equally on Maori and European foundations, was a political aspiration rather than a social reality. In practice, the country that young Howard navigated was one in which Maori people were welcome in certain places and not in others, valued for certain contributions and expected to suppress others, celebrated when their presence was convenient and reminded of their place when it was not. The process by which a Maori child in 1935 Rotorua learned to understand and manage these contradictions was not a process anyone described explicitly. It was simply the air. Howard Morrison absorbed it all, and at some point in his adolescence, he made a decision, the kind of decision that looks, in retrospect, both inevitable and extraordinary, to take everything the world had given him, the music and the warmth and the Maori ease with performance, and the understanding of what an audience needed, and to walk out onto a stage with it and refuse to be diminished. He was, from very early, a natural performer, not merely talented. Talented was inadequate to describe what Howard Morrison brought to a stage. He had the quality that the greatest entertainers share, the capacity to make every person in an audience feel that the performance is specifically and personally for them. He made people feel seen, heard, included, celebrated. He had warmth that was not manufactured and energy that was not forced. And these qualities, combined with a voice of considerable power and flexibility and a comedic instinct that was both precise and generous, produced something that New Zealand had never quite seen before. The Howard Morrison Quartet formed in 1957. The 4 young men, Howard, Jerry Marito, Jerry Edmonds, and Wilson Hoppe, came together with an understanding of what they were doing that belied their youth. They were not simply making music. They were making a statement. They were saying, with every performance, that Maori voices could fill any stage in New Zealand, could command any audience, could produce the kind of entertainment that the country's mainstream had assumed was the exclusive province of its European citizens.
And they were saying this not through protest or politics, but through the disarming, almost irresistible medium of joy. The hits came quickly. They came in the particular New Zealand form that Howard Morrison had invented almost single-handedly: the comic song, the parody, the piece that took a familiar tune and fitted it with words that made New Zealand laugh at itself, with a warmth and self-recognition that no previous entertainer had managed to produce. My Old Man's in All Black, The Battle of the Waikato, songs that became national anthems of a different kind, the anthems of a country recognizing itself in a mirror that had never been held up quite this way before. Songs that people sang at parties and kitchen tables and sports grounds that became part of the texture of what it meant to be a New Zealander in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But underneath the laughter and the warmth and the national embrace, the barriers were still there. The venues that would not book a Maori act regardless of the act's reputation. The hotels that would accommodate the European members of a touring party but decline the Maori members. The radio programmers and the record industry figures who understood Howard Morrison's commercial value perfectly well and used it to produce returns for themselves that were not reflected in what found its way to the people who had done the performing. The New Zealand that loved Howard Morrison was not always or entirely a New Zealand that had decided to treat Howard Morrison as an equal. He navigated these realities with a discipline that was itself a kind of performance. The performance of someone who has decided that the work is more important than the grievance, that the audience is more important than the obstacle, that the music must continue regardless of what the system around the music is doing. He did not, in public, speak extensively about the barriers. He performed around them. He continued. He filled the venues that would have him and built audiences so large and so loyal that the venues that had refused him eventually reconsidered, not because they had changed their minds, but because the market had made the decision for them. This was Howard Morrison's particular genius, not only the voice and the warmth and the comedy, but the strategic intelligence of a man who understood exactly how power worked and had decided on the most effective available response to it.
Who was paying attention to what he was actually carrying? And who was content to simply enjoy the performance without asking what it cost? The Queen knew his name before many New Zealanders had acknowledged what he represented. Howard Morrison performed for Queen Elizabeth II and for members of the royal family on multiple occasions, representing New Zealand at events of the Commonwealth and the kind of official cultural diplomacy that required a country to put forward its most distinguished voices. He stood on stages in London and in other great cities of the Commonwealth, and he sang. And the audiences responded with the same warmth that audiences in Rotorua and Auckland and Wellington had always given him, because the quality he brought to a performance was not diminished by geography or altered by the scale of the occasion. The photographs from those performances show a young man in formal attire, comfortable and authoritative on a stage of any size, the smile fully present, the voice clearly the equal of anything the occasion required. They show someone who had arrived, who had, against the specific resistances of the world he had grown up in, placed himself on stages that those resistances had been designed to prevent him from reaching. But the photographs from those Commonwealth performances exist alongside other photographs from the same period. Photographs of the cramped touring conditions that Maori acts endured, while their European counterparts received better treatment. Photographs of the small print in the contracts that, in the 1960s, were typically negotiated by promoters and managers who had significantly more experience in the mechanics of the music industry than the young Maori artists they were representing. Contracts that assigned rights and royalties in ways that seemed, at the time, to be the standard arrangements of a professional career, and that looked, in retrospect, rather different. The music industry that Howard Morrison entered in the late 1950s was not structured to serve the interests of Maori artists. It was structured to serve the interests of the people who controlled the venues and the labels and the radio playlists and the promotional machinery. Howard Morrison was, from the perspective of those people, a commercial asset, a name and a voice and a following that could be converted into revenue.
The question of whether the revenue was being distributed equitably between the asset and the people exploiting the asset was not one that the industry structures were designed to ask. He continued performing. He continued filling venues. He continued producing the warmth and the comedy and the genuine human connection that were uniquely what he could give an audience. And the gap between what that gift was worth and what he received for it was a gap that his closest colleagues sometimes described in later years as one of the quiet injustices of his career.
Not the kind of injustice that produces headlines or legal proceedings, but the kind that accumulates in a file of contracts and a pattern of arrangements and a set of relationships between a performer and an industry that had, from the beginning, understood the relationship differently than he did. What did the contracts actually say? And who, in those rooms where they were signed, was looking out for Howard Morrison? There are witnesses to the Howard Morrison of the rehearsal room and the dressing room and the long drives between venues who describe someone quite different from the public performer. Not contradictory to him, but additional to him. Someone who was quieter than the stage suggested. Someone who carried the music and the performance with a seriousness that the comedy concealed. Someone who thought carefully about what he was doing and why. Who understood that his role was not only entertainment, but something closer to cultural mediation. The work of making Maori visibility normal in a country that had not always considered it so. He mentored younger Maori artists with a generosity that those who received it consistently described as transformative. He understood that his success was not only his own, that it had opened something for the generation behind him, and that the opening needed to be maintained and extended through deliberate acts of support and recognition. The artists he lifted and the careers he helped shape are part of his legacy in ways that never appeared in the official lists of his achievements, because mentorship is not the kind of thing that gets counted in industry awards. But the mentorship cost time and energy that could have been spent on his own career, and the commitment to community and to the work of cultural representation was a commitment that the industry's financial structures did not reward. You were paid for the performance.
You were not paid for what the performance meant, or what it made possible, or the decades of invisible work that gave it the authority it carried. How many of the people who filled those venues understood what they were actually watching? And what did Howard Morrison himself understand about the nature of the bargain he had made? The television era gave Howard Morrison a new stage and a new audience. New Zealand television in the 1960s was, like New Zealand in general, in the process of discovering what it was and what it wanted to be, and Howard Morrison was one of the people who helped it find an answer to those questions. He appeared on screen with the same ease and authority he brought to live performance. Perhaps more, because the intimacy of the television medium suited something in his quality that the live stage, for all its power, could not quite replicate. He was funny on television. He was warm. He was, in the precise and irreplaceable sense, present. There in the room with you, regardless of the actual distance. His television work expanded his audience beyond the people who could attend a live performance, and embedded him in the daily life of the country in a way that no previous Maori entertainer had achieved. He was in people's living rooms. He was part of the furniture of ordinary New Zealand life. Children grew up with him as a reference point for what it meant to be entertaining, to be present, to be good at the specific and demanding art of making a large group of people feel something simultaneously. And still the barriers existed. Not always the blunt, refusable barriers of earlier decades. The venue that would not book a Maori act. The hotel that would not accommodate a Maori guest. Those had diminished, though not disappeared. What remained was subtler and in some ways more difficult to address. The assumption that certain kinds of recognition were for other people. That certain levels of official acknowledgement were calibrated for a different kind of career. That the work Howard Morrison had done, however excellent, however commercially significant, however culturally important, was work of a category that sat slightly outside the main frame of what the country formally honored. The knighthood did not come until 2009. He was 73 years old, and he had been ill for 2 years. He had been performing in various forms for over 50 years. He had been, for most of that time, the most recognized entertainer in the country. Recognized at stadiums and at kitchen tables and at the events that mark the significant moments of a nation's collective life. And the official recognition, when it finally arrived in time to be attended by the people who had gathered to say goodbye. This was the particular accounting of a career that had given more than it had received, in the specific currency of official acknowledgement that a country uses to tell its citizens what it values. Howard Morrison had been valued, clearly and continuously, by the people who bought the tickets and watched the television programs and sang the songs at parties. What had taken longer, what had taken specifically the full duration of a career and the approach of its end, was the translation of that popular valuation into the formal recognition that the country's honor system was designed to provide. Why did it take so long? And was anyone in the official structures asking that question? In the final months of his life, Howard Morrison moved between the care that his condition required and the public presence that his character demanded. He had been, for his entire adult life, someone whose identity was bound up with performance, not in the superficial sense of needing an audience to feel real, but in the deeper sense of someone for whom the act of being present to other people was both a vocation and a necessity. The stroke had limited what that presence could look like, but it had not ended the impulse. The people who saw him in those months described a man who was at peace with his life in ways that suggested he had made his reckoning with it long before the formal ceremony of the knighthood. He had built something. He knew what he had built. The country's official systems had been slow to acknowledge it, and the industry's financial structures had not treated it equitably, and the racial barriers that he had spent a career performing around had left their marks in ways that the public performances had never shown. But the music had been real. The warmth had been real. The audiences had been real. The younger artists he had lifted had gone on to build their own careers. The work had been done.
On the 24th of September, 2009, Howard Morrison died in Rotorua, the city where he had been born, the city of his iwi, the city that had produced him, and that he had, in his own way, placed on the map of the world's attention. He was 74 years old. The tributes were immediate, extensive, and genuinely felt. The Prime Minister spoke, the Governor General spoke, the leaders of the music industry spoke, and the television broadcasters spoke, and the sporting bodies whose events he had graced for decades spoke. Every tribute acknowledged the scope of his achievement. Every tribute noted that he had been the country's greatest entertainer. Every tribute mentioned the knighthood. Almost none of them examined the timing. Almost none of them asked what it meant that the formal recognition had come when it came, 3 months before his death, after 2 years of serious illness, more than half a century into a career that had been, by any reasonable measure, among the most significant in New Zealand's cultural history. Almost none of them asked what the industry had paid him, or what the contracts had said, or whether the financial story of his career matched the cultural significance that everyone was now so eager to celebrate. The funerary oratory of a nation has its own conventions, and one of those conventions is that the full accounting waits. The difficult questions are softened by grief. The financial injustices are subsumed in the warmth of remembrance. The systematic disadvantages that shaped a career are acknowledged, if at all, as the unfortunate conditions of a different era, rather than the deliberate choices of identifiable systems and identifiable people. Howard Morrison would have understood this. He had spent 60 years managing the gap between what the country said about him and what it actually provided. He had done it with grace and with discipline, and with the extraordinary performing intelligence that had made him what he was. He had translated the dissonance into music, and the music into connection, and the connection into something that the country experienced as a gift, without quite recognizing how much the giving had cost. The hotels that had turned him away are no longer in business. The contracts from the 1960s are in files that nobody opens. The venues that had once required a second thought before booking a Maori act have been replaced, several times over, by other venues with other management and other policies. But the songs remain. My Old Man's in All Black is still sung at rugby matches and school assemblies, and the kind of informal national gathering that New Zealand conducts at the edges of its public events. The recordings remain. The voice, the warmth, the comedy, the precision of an entertainer who understood his audience with an intimacy that half a century has not diminished. The younger artists he mentored are still performing, still making careers in the tradition he established and extended and made possible. And the question remains, not in the official record, but in the space between the official record and the full truth of what happened. A knighthood in June, a death in September, a career that lasted 50 years and produced a legacy that outlasted the career. What does a country owe the person who gave it its voice? And when is the right time to say so? Sir Howard Morrison received his answer 3 months before he stopped being able to hear it. The rest of New Zealand is still working out what that means.
The Rotorua of Howard Morrison's childhood was a city that existed in two registers simultaneously, and the ability to move between them, to inhabit both without losing oneself in either, was a skill that its Maori residents developed from early childhood as a condition of ordinary life. The tourist-facing Rotorua, the one that appeared in the brochures and the promotional materials and the accounts of overseas visitors, was a place of thermal wonder and cultural spectacle. The geysers and the mud pools and the performances of traditional Maori culture that drew visitors from around the world to witness something they understood as ancient, exotic, and safely contained within the frame of tourist experience. The other Rotorua, the one its Maori residents actually lived in, was a community navigating the daily realities of a colonial society that valued Maori culture as spectacle while treating Maori people as citizens of a complicated and unequal kind. Howard Morrison grew up in the second Rotorua, while being, from an early age, aware of the first.
He understood that his culture was simultaneously celebrated and marginalized, that the haka and the waiata and the carving and the weaving that made up the living tissue of his community's existence were things that the country around him found beautiful when they appeared in controlled performances, and threatening when they appeared in any other context. He understood this with the instinctive accuracy of someone who has absorbed a complex social reality long before he has the vocabulary to describe it. What he did with this understanding was, in retrospect, one of the most strategically sophisticated moves in New Zealand cultural history. He took the country's appetite for Maori performance and he redirected it, not toward the contained, picturesque version that the tourist industry required, but towards something altogether more dynamic and contemporary and genuinely Maori. He made the country laugh with him rather than at him. He made it sing songs that were rooted in Maori humor and Maori ways of seeing the world, delivered with a warmth and an energy that the audience experienced as entirely inclusive, without quite realizing that what they were being included in was a Maori cultural tradition that had been reshaped and modernized and brought to bear on the realities of mid-century New Zealand with extraordinary precision. This was not a simple or straightforward thing to do. It required the negotiation of contradictions that would have defeated a less gifted or less determined person. It required being Maori enough to carry the authenticity that gave the work its power, while being accessible enough to command the mainstream audiences that gave the career its commercial foundation. It required maintaining simultaneously the cultural identity that was the source of everything he did, and the professional persona that the industry and the mainstream audience required. And it required doing all of this in a context where the boundaries were not clearly defined, and the penalties for getting the balance wrong could be severe. Howard Morrison made it look effortless. That was perhaps his greatest performance. The performance of ease, the appearance of someone for whom none of the contradictions were difficult, for whom the stage was simply the natural place to be, and the audience was simply the natural extension of the community he had grown up in. The people who watched him, whether in Rotorua or Auckland or London, saw a man completely at home with himself, and with them. They did not see the work of negotiating the impossible position he occupied. They were not meant to. The Howard Morrison Quartet in its prime years was one of the most remarkable musical phenomena New Zealand has produced. 4 young men from Rotorua, playing to audiences across the country and beyond, producing music that was genuinely and distinctively New Zealand in a way that nothing before them had been. The comic songs, the parodies, the reworkings of familiar tunes with new words that spoke directly to the specifics of New Zealand life were the surface of what they did, and the surface was brilliant. But underneath the comedy was a musicianship of real quality, a genuine ensemble playing that gave the performances their coherence and their authority. Jerry Merito and Jerry Edmonds and Wilson Hoppy were, in the fullest sense, Howard Morrison's collaborators, the architecture that supported the voice that audiences came to hear. Their collective instinct for performance, the way they could read a room and adjust and give the audience exactly what it needed at each moment, was the product of years of playing together and an understanding of each other that went beyond professional competence into something closer to musical intimacy. The quartet was not a solo act with backing musicians. It was a genuine ensemble, and the years during which it functioned at full power were years during which New Zealand popular music was something that the rest of the world had genuine reason to pay attention to. And then the changes came. The music industry changed. The tastes changed.
The particular form of entertainment that the Howard Morrison Quartet had perfected was not what the 1970s demanded, and the 1970s were not kind to acts that had defined the previous decade. Howard Morrison adapted. He always adapted. It was one of his fundamental qualities. But adaptation has its costs, and the costs were borne, as the costs of entertainment careers always are, by the person at the center of the act. His solo career after the quartet's peak years was a demonstration of what a talent of his quality could do when deprived of the specific context that had produced his greatest work. He continued performing. He found new audiences for what he was doing and maintained old audiences for what he had been.
He worked in television and in corporate entertainment, and at the events, the civic celebrations, the national commemorations, the sporting occasions, that required someone who could hold an audience and make it feel the occasion was worth feeling. He was reliable in a way that very few performers at his level managed to be reliable, and the reliability was the product of discipline and professionalism that his public ease made invisible. But the financial returns of this phase of the career were not what they should have been. The structures that determined how a performer at Howard Morrison's level was compensated for his work, the rates for corporate engagements, the royalties on recordings, the licensing fees for the use of music that had been created decades earlier, were structures that had been established during the years when the industry held all the leverage, and they were not structures that had been substantially revised in the intervening time. The recordings from the 1960s and 70s continued to generate revenue for the people who held the rights to them. What found its way back to Howard Morrison was, by the accounts of people who knew the details of his financial situation, considerably less than the value of what he had created would have justified. He did not speak about this in public. He was not, by temperament or by choice, someone who aired financial grievances in the forums where they would have been most effective, in the press, in the industry forums where practices could be examined and challenged, in the political conversations about the treatment of Maori artists that were beginning to become possible in the New Zealand of the 1980s and 90s. He had spent his career performing around the barriers rather than confronting them directly, and this remained his instinct, even when confrontation might have produced more equitable outcomes. This restraint was, depending on how you read it, either a quality of exceptional dignity or a quality that the industry was able to exploit. Both readings are available. Neither one requires the other to be wrong. The mentoring work that defined the later years of his career was, in its own way, a form of the same cultural investment that the quartet's early years had represented.
Howard Morrison understood that his place in New Zealand's entertainment history carried an obligation, that the doors he had opened had to be kept open, that the visibility he had established for Maori performers had to be extended and maintained and passed to the generation behind him. He gave time and attention and the specific knowledge that only someone with his experience could give. He made introductions and opened stages and told younger artists, with the authority of someone who had been there, that the stage was theirs to take. The artists he mentored went on to careers that built on what he had made possible. The debt they owed him, and that they consistently and generously acknowledged, was a debt that could not be repaid in the currency the industry recognized. It was the kind of debt that accrues in a tradition, in a lineage, in the continuity of a culture's capacity to produce what it needs to produce. Howard Morrison was part of that continuity. He understood his role in it. The question was whether the country understood it too. What exactly does a country owe the person who spent his life building the culture it takes for granted? And is there a form of accounting that captures it? By the time the 2000s arrived, Howard Morrison was approaching his 70s, and New Zealand was beginning the gradual, complicated process of reckoning with what it had and had not done for the Maori artists who had built its entertainment culture. The Treaty of Waitangi settlement process was producing, slowly and imperfectly, a re-examination of what the country owed its Maori citizens in various domains. The question of what it owed Maori cultural figures, the artists and performers and musicians who'd given the country its distinctiveness while operating within a system that had not treated them equitably, was a subset of this larger reckoning that received less systematic attention than it deserved. Howard Morrison did not wait for the system to catch up with what he was owed. He continued performing. He continued mentoring. He continued appearing at the events and occasions that needed him, because the country needed him, and because the work was what he had always done and what he understood himself to be for. He carried the weight of it with the same performing intelligence he had always brought to the stage, making it look lighter than it was, making the carrying look like ease, giving the audience the version that served them best, rather than the version that told them everything.
In 2007, the stroke came. It came the way strokes come, without preparation, without the gradual escalation that allows a person to make adjustments, without the courtesy of warning. He survived it. He fought the aftermath with the stubbornness that had always been the other side of his charm, the quality that the warmth and the ease concealed, the quality that had actually made the career possible. He worked to recover what the stroke had taken. He returned to public life in whatever capacity he could manage. He remained for the people who loved him and for the country that had grown up with him, stubbornly present. The knighthood came in June of 2009. 3 months later, on the 24th of September, Howard Morrison died. The tributes were extensive and genuine. New Zealand mourned him with the warmth he had spent a lifetime providing. The official ceremonies were dignified. The private grief of the people who had known him, the musicians and the broadcasters and the younger artists he had mentored, and the community in Rotorua that had produced him, was something different and deeper than the official ceremonies could contain. And in the space between the official tributes and the full truth, the question remained. Not the question of whether Howard Morrison was great. No one disputed that. Not the question of whether he had contributed. The contribution was the foundational premise of every tribute. But the question of timing. The question of what it means to honor someone 3 months before they die, after 50 years of service. The question of what the industry paid him and what it kept. The question of who was in those rooms when the contracts were drawn up and what those contracts said. The question of whether the racial barriers he spent his career performing around left marks that the official record of his career was too polite to name. New Zealand loved Howard Morrison. It loved him freely and generously and continuously for 50 years.
What it was slower to do, what it managed to do, in the end, only just in time, was to say so in the formal, official, institutional language of a nation expressing what it values. A knighthood in June, a death in September. The songs remain. The voice remains on the recordings. The younger artists he mentored are still performing, still adding to a tradition that he built from the specific materials of his own life and his own culture, and his own extraordinary, disciplined, generous talent. The debt remains too, not the kind that can be settled by an official ceremony, but the kind that accrues in a culture's understanding of what it owes the people who gave it its most distinctive voice. Howard Morrison gave New Zealand its voice. He gave it for 50 years, without asking too loudly for anything in return. He received his knighthood 3 months before he died. And somewhere in that accounting, in the gap between the giving and the receiving, between the career and the recognition, between the man and the official version of the man, the full story of what New Zealand did and did not do for its greatest entertainer is still waiting to be told. The records are in the files. The contracts are in the archives. The voices of the people who were in those rooms are still available if anyone wants to ask. Does New Zealand want to ask? That question, unlike the others, is still open. The music industry that Howard Morrison entered in the late 1950s operated according to rules that had been written by the people who controlled the infrastructure, the studios, the pressing plants, the distribution networks, the radio playlists, the promotional machinery that determined which records reached which audiences. These were not, in the New Zealand of 1957, Maori people. They were Pākehā businessmen who had built or inherited positions of commercial advantage in an industry that was young enough to be shaping its own norms as it grew. The artists who worked within this system, who brought the talent that gave the system something to sell, were in a position that the system's structure did not particularly incentivize anyone to examine too carefully. The standard arrangements of the era were not unique to New Zealand, and they were not unique to Maori artists.
The music industry of the 1950s and 60s was, throughout the English-speaking world, an industry in which the relationship between creative talent and commercial return was systematically skewed in favor of the people who held the infrastructure, rather than the people who provided the content. American rhythm and blues artists, British rock and roll musicians, Australian country performers, all of them navigated versions of the same arrangement that Howard Morrison and his contemporaries encountered in New Zealand. The creative work was the basis of the industry's value.
The creative workers were the last to see the results of that value converted into money. For Maori artists in New Zealand, this general disadvantage was compounded by the specific disadvantage of operating in a context where the racial dynamics of the society added further leverage to the people on the other side of the negotiating table. A Pakeha manager or promoter dealing with a young Maori artist in 1958 operated in a context where the artist's alternatives were limited not only by the normal commercial constraints, but by the additional constraints of a society that had not yet fully decided to treat Maori people as equal participants in its economic life. The music business was an unusual space, one of the few arenas in which Maori talent could achieve mainstream recognition and commercial success. But unusual space did not mean level playing field. It meant a different kind of inequality, one that was less visible and therefore more difficult to challenge. Howard Morrison did not, in public, discuss these dynamics in detail. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, someone who avoided the subject entirely in private. He was too intelligent and too observant to pretend that the arrangements of his career had been perfectly equitable. But the public persona he maintained was one that prioritized the performance over the complaint, the music over the accounting, the relationship with the audience over the analysis of the industry that mediated it. This was a choice, and it was a choice that served the career in certain ways. It maintained the warmth and the accessibility that were the foundations of his public identity. It avoided the alienation of audiences who might have been uncomfortable with a more explicitly critical position. And it preserved the energy for the work rather than the fight. But the choice had costs.
The financial arrangements that were established in those early years, when the leverage was most asymmetric, became the baseline from which subsequent negotiations proceeded. The rights assigned in the contracts of the 1960s remained assigned, in many cases, to the same parties or their successors for decades afterward. The royalty structures that were acceptable in an era when recording artists had limited alternative routes to market did not automatically improve when the market changed and the alternatives multiplied. The people who held the rights continued to hold them. The recordings continued to generate revenue, and the distribution of that revenue continued to reflect the arrangements that had been made at the moment of maximum disadvantage. This is not unusual. It is the ordinary history of the music industry in the 20th century, repeated in different keys, across different countries and different genres, and different communities of artists. But ordinary does not mean acceptable, and the ordinariness of the pattern does not reduce the weight of what it meant for the specific person who experienced it. For Howard Morrison, the financial story of his career was one element of a larger account that also included the racial barriers, the delayed official recognition, and the gap between the public celebration of his work and the private reality of what that work had provided. He spoke about music the way musicians speak about it, when the music is genuinely the thing, when it is not primarily a vehicle for income or status, but a direct expression of who you are and what you come from and what you understand about the world. His interviews over the years return consistently to the songs and the performances and the audiences and the younger artists he was working with. The financial structures are present in the background of these conversations, but they are rarely foregrounded. He was interested in the music. He was interested in what the music could do for the people who heard it. The accounting of what the music had done for him was a different kind of conversation, and not one he was inclined to have in public. The gap between these two conversations, between the conversation about the music and the conversation about the money, is one of the defining features of his story. It is a gap that the official tributes, following his lead, tended not to examine too closely. The tributes were about the music.
They were about the warmth and the comedy and the voice and the legacy. They were, in their way, exactly what Howard Morrison would have wanted them to be. They were also, in the same way, incomplete. The incomplete tributes are not a failure of the people who gave them. They are the result of a long-established convention about how we speak of the dead, and what we choose to examine, and what we choose to allow the warmth of mourning to smooth over. Howard Morrison had spent his career making people feel good. In death, the country reciprocated in the only way it knew how. It made his memory comfortable. It found the words that honored what he had given, and declined to examine too carefully what had been taken. But the people who had been closest to him, the musicians and the colleagues, and the members of the community in Rotorua who would watch the whole arc of his career from close range, carried a different and more complete account. They knew what the contracts had said. They knew what the industry had taken. They knew what the barriers had cost. They knew the difference between the public Howard Morrison and the private one, and they understood that the gap between those two versions was itself a kind of performance, the performance of a man who had decided, for reasons that were entirely his own and entirely comprehensible, that the show must go on.
the show always went on with Howard Morrison. That was, in the end, both his greatest achievement and the most comprehensive expression of what his career had required of him. The tradition he established continues. The younger artists he mentored carry it forward in studios and on stages across New Zealand, producing music that is recognizably connected to what he made possible. The comic songs, the particular form of Maori humor and cultural observation that the quartet had brought to the country's mainstream, have descendants in the work of entertainers who might not always trace the lineage back to Howard Morrison explicitly, but who are performing in a tradition that would not exist without him. The recordings are there, the voice is there. A country that wants to understand what it was and what it is and what it owes can find, in those recordings and in the career they document, a detailed and precise account of how a Maori artist of extraordinary talent navigated a society that loved what he gave it, while being slower than it should have been to provide what it owed him in return.
Sir Howard Morrison, knighted in June, gone in September. The greatest entertainer his country produced. The recognition owed to him arrived 3 months before he died. The rest of what was owed him, the financial accounting, the honest examination of the barriers, the acknowledgement of what the industry took and what the system cost, those remain outstanding. New Zealand knows what it received. The question of what it paid is the one that the files and the contracts and the memories of the people who were in those rooms could still, if anyone wanted to look, answer. Does New Zealand want to look? That answer, unlike Howard Morrison's legacy, is still being decided. There is a particular kind of national forgetting that is not quite forgetting, that maintains the name and the image and the general sense of significance, while allowing the specific, uncomfortable details to soften and fade. Howard Morrison has not been forgotten. His name is still known. His songs are still sung. His face is still familiar to anyone who was alive in New Zealand in the decades of his greatest work. What has faded? What the warmth of the tributes and the official ceremonies of mourning have allowed to soften are the specifics, the contracts, the barriers, the timing of the recognition, the gap between what the country said about him and what it actually provided. This is not unusual. It is how national memory typically works. The figure is retained. The accounting is not. The statue is erected. The files are not opened. The song is sung at the national occasion. The royalty statement is not examined. New Zealand's memory of Howard Morrison is complete in the ways that feel comfortable, and incomplete in the ways that require discomfort to sustain. The discomfort, for those willing to experience it, is instructive. The timing of the knighthood is not a small detail. It is the most precise single expression available of how long the official structures of the country took to say what the audiences had been saying for 50 years. The audiences knew in 1958. The stadiums knew in 1965. The families who sang his songs in their kitchens knew through every decade of his career. The official system of recognition took until 2009, 3 months before he died.
That gap between the audience's knowledge and the official knowledge, between the popular recognition and the institutional recognition, is the gap in which most of the important questions about Howard Morrison's career live. It is the gap in which the contracts were signed, and the royalties were distributed, and the rights were assigned, and the barriers were maintained, and the mentoring was done without compensation, and the work was given over and over again to a country that received it with warmth and returned it with delay. The artists who came after him, the Maori entertainers who built careers on the foundation he laid, who found stages open to them in part because he had opened them, understand this accounting in the way that direct inheritors of a tradition understand the cost of what they received. They know what he gave. They know what it cost him to give it. And they know that the knighthood arrived in June of 2009, 3 months before the man who had earned it could no longer be present to receive what should have come with it. The recordings are Howard Morrison's permanent presence in the culture. The voice on those recordings is the voice that stood on the stages that would not always book him, and sang for the Queen who recognized him, and filled the venues where the ordinary people of New Zealand came to feel what he could make them feel. It is a voice of extraordinary quality and extraordinary warmth,
and it carries in its performances the full weight of what he was and what he gave and what he navigated in the course of giving it. Listen to the recordings. Listen to what is there. The music, the comedy, the warmth, the precision, the ease that was never as easy as it looked. And then listen for what is not there. The contracts, the barriers, the timing, the accounting of what it cost. The recordings cannot carry that. They can only carry what they carry, the performance, the gift, the thing that Howard Morrison gave his country, and that his country, in its characteristically belated and incomplete way, eventually and genuinely loved. He gave New Zealand its voice. He gave it for 50 years. The knighthood arrived 3 months before the voice went quiet. And the rest of what was owed, the full accounting, the honest reckoning, the examination of what the barriers cost and what the industry took, remains, as it has always remained, in the files.
New Zealand's greatest entertainer died without the full recognition he was owed. The recognition that arrived was real and genuinely felt. It was also 3 months late, 50 years late, and incomplete in ways that the warmth of the ceremonies could not conceal from anyone who was paying careful attention. Howard Morrison was always paying careful attention. He had been paying it since he was a child in Rotorua, learning to navigate the 2 registers of a city that existed simultaneously in celebration and in constraint. He paid it through 50 years of performance, and through the specific, disciplined intelligence with which he managed the gap between what the country offered him and what it owed him. The recordings are there. The voice is there. The question is whether New Zealand is ready, finally, to pay the same kind of attention back. The particular quality of Howard Morrison's comedy, the thing that made it different from the comedy being produced by other New Zealand entertainers of his era, was its specificity. He did not traffic in the generic, the universal, the carefully neutralized humor that could travel anywhere because it came from nowhere. He trafficked in the specific textures of New Zealand life, and specifically in the Maori dimensions of those textures that the mainstream entertainment industry had, before him, either ignored or treated as exotic decoration rather than central subject. The songs about rugby and about small-town New Zealand life and about the particular absurdities of the colonial inheritance were funny in the way that things are funny when they are precisely and honestly observed. Not manufactured amusement, but genuine recognition. The laughter of a people seeing themselves accurately reflected for the first time. He gave New Zealand a mirror, and New Zealand laughed at what it saw, and the laughter was the sound of recognition rather than mockery, and that distinction was the difference between a career that lasted decades and one that might have lasted years. The management of the racial dimension of his public work was itself a form of artistic achievement of a high order. He was performing, always, in the space between what Maori culture offered and what the mainstream would accept, and the calibration of that space, knowing how far to push and when to hold back, and how to make the audience comfortable enough with its own discomfort that the discomfort became productive rather than alienating, required the kind of social intelligence that schools do not teach and careers do not usually provide adequate preparation for. He had it instinctively, and he had it in abundance, and he used it with the same generous precision that he brought to everything else. The younger Maori artists who observed him working in this space, who saw, from close range, how he managed the contradictions of the position he occupied, learned things from watching him that could not have been learned any other way. The specific lessons varied: how to read a room, how to find the warmth in an audience that might initially be uncertain, how to make your cultural specificity an asset rather than a liability in a mainstream context, how to maintain your integrity while operating within a commercial system that was not designed with your integrity in mind. These lessons were available to anyone paying attention. Howard Morrison taught them by example, continuously, for 50 years. The people who received these lessons and built careers on them are the most permanent element of his legacy. More permanent, in a sense, than the recordings, though the recordings are extraordinary, because the lessons are alive in the work of living artists who are currently performing and currently shaping what New Zealand entertainment is and what it can be. The tradition is not an archive, it is an ongoing practice, and the practice is traceable, by anyone who looks carefully at its history, to the specific choices and the specific achievements of the man who established it. What would New Zealand popular music look like if Howard Morrison had not been there?
The counterfactual is impossible to calculate with precision, but the outline is clear enough. The particular integration of Maori cultural content into the mainstream entertainment industry, the way that integration happened, on terms that preserved Maori dignity and Maori cultural specificity rather than flattening them into something the mainstream could consume without being changed by, would have happened differently, or more slowly, or not at all in the form it took.
The stages that subsequent Maori artists found available to them were stages that Howard Morrison had in many cases literally or effectively opened. The audiences that received subsequent Maori artists with the warmth and familiarity that made their careers possible had in many cases been prepared for that reception by 50 years of Howard Morrison's work. This is the legacy that is hardest to quantify and easiest to overlook because it is structural rather than individual. It is present not in a specific song or a specific performance, but in the general shape of what New Zealand entertainment became, in the absence of certain barriers, in the presence of certain possibilities, in the normalization of a Maori presence on mainstream stages that was, before Howard Morrison, not normal at all. The knighthood acknowledged the individual achievement. It did not and could not quantify the structural legacy. The structural legacy does not fit in a ceremony or an obituary or an official tribute. It fits in the careers of the artists who came after him, and in the culture they produce, and in the audiences that receive that culture with a readiness and a warmth that has been, at least in part, inherited from the 50 years during which Howard Morrison was making New Zealand comfortable with the idea that its greatest entertainers might be Maori. He built something. He built it under conditions that were not designed to assist the building, using resources that were not always distributed fairly, at a cost that the official record does not fully document. And what he built is still standing, still being used, still producing the warmth and the laughter and the cultural recognition that were always its purpose. The knighthood came in June. He died in September. The building remains. New Zealand's greatest entertainer did not die without recognition. He died with a knighthood 3 months old and a legacy 50 years deep, and a country that genuinely, if incompletely, understood what it had been given. The recognition he was owed, the full accounting, the honest examination of what the barriers had cost and what the industry had taken, and what the timing of the official honor said about the speed of the country's gratitude. That recognition is still being assembled. It is being assembled in the work of the artists who carry his tradition forward.
It is being assembled in the conversations that are slowly becoming possible in New Zealand about what the country owes its Maori cultural figures. It is being assembled, one honest examination at a time, in the growing willingness to look at the full story rather than the comfortable version. Sir Howard Morrison gave New Zealand everything he had. New Zealand is still working out what to give back. The recordings are waiting. The files are waiting. The voices of the people who were there, who signed the contracts and attended the performances and watched the career from close range, are still available if anyone wants to ask them what they saw. The greatest entertainer New Zealand produced died in Rotorua on the 24th of September 2009. His knighthood was 3 months old. His legacy was 50 years deep. And the full recognition he was owed, the kind that requires not just a ceremony but an honest reckoning, was and remains still coming. Consider the specific geography of Howard Morrison's career, not the geography of stadiums and television studios and Commonwealth stages, but the geography of the country's understanding of itself. When he began performing in the late 1950s, New Zealand was a country that had not yet worked out how to see itself clearly. It had a Maori half and a European half, and a set of official stories that presented the two halves as more equal and more integrated than the daily reality of New Zealand life in 1957 would have supported. The entertainment industry reflected this. It had room for Maori performance, of a certain kind, in certain contexts, under certain conditions. What it did not have, before Howard Morrison, was the recognition that Maori entertainment in its full contemporary form, funny, warm, specific, commercially powerful, culturally confident, was something that mainstream New Zealand audiences would not merely tolerate, but embrace. He provided that recognition. He provided it not by arguing for it, or demanding it, or petitioning the industry to accept it, but by performing it into existence. He went on stage, and he sang, and he was funny, and he was warm, and the audiences responded.
and the response accumulated, and the accumulated response became, over years and decades, a fact of New Zealand cultural life that the industry and the mainstream had to accommodate because the audiences had already decided.
This is how cultural change sometimes happens, not through the formal channels of policy and legislation and official acknowledgement, but through the stubbornly accumulating reality of what people actually respond to, what they actually value, what they actually want from the culture that surrounds them. Howard Morrison created that accumulation. He created it with the specific and irreplaceable quality of his talent, and he maintained it with the specific and irreplaceable quality of his discipline, and it became one of the foundational facts of what New Zealand entertainment is. The country is still living in the world he helped create. The Maori artists who perform on mainstream stages today perform in a context that is different from the context of 1957. And the difference is not only the result of political and social change, though those changes matter. It is also the result of 50 years of Howard Morrison standing on stages and performing with authority and warmth and cultural specificity, and proving over and over again that Maori entertainment was not a niche but a mainstream, not a concession but a contribution, not a tolerated exception but a central expression of what New Zealand culture actually was. He proved it in the most conclusive possible way, by making people love it. Not intellectually, not as an exercise in cultural tolerance or social progress, but viscerally, in the way audiences love entertainment that speaks to them directly and honestly, and with genuine feeling. He made New Zealand love what he gave it. And what he gave it was, at its core, Maori, rooted in the culture and the humor and the warmth of Te Arawa and of Rotorua, and of a way of being in the world that was his before it was his audience's. The knighthood came in June of 2009. It was 3 months before he died, and 52 years after the Howard Morrison Quartet played its first performances in Rotorua. The timing is the full story, compressed into a single fact. Everything else, the contracts, the barriers, the mentoring, the recordings, the audiences, the tradition, elaborates that fact without changing it. He gave New Zealand everything he had for 50 years, and the official recognition came 3 months before the end. The recordings carry his voice into whatever future New Zealand makes for itself.
The tradition he established carries his influence into the work of every Maori artist who performs on a mainstream stage, with the confidence that the stage is theirs to occupy. The question he leaves behind, the question of what a country owes the people who gave it its voice, and how it demonstrates that it knows what it owes, is the question that the timing of the knighthood poses, with a precision that no official tribute has yet directly addressed. New Zealand's greatest entertainer. A knighthood in June. A death in September. 50 years of giving. And the recognition that arrived, when it arrived just in time to be included in the obituaries. The full recognition, the accounting, the honesty, the reckoning with what the barriers cost, and what the industry took, and what the timing said about the speed of a country's gratitude, that recognition is still being written. It will be written, in the end, by the artists who carry the tradition he built. It will be written in the work they produce and the stages they stand on, and the audiences they bring into the same kind of warmth and recognition that Howard Morrison produced every time he walked out under the lights and gave the country what it needed. He gave it for 50 years. The full accounting of what it cost him and what it was worth, and what New Zealand owes in return, that is the remaining work. And it is work that, given what he gave, the country has an obligation to complete. Sir Howard Morrison, Rotorua, 1935 to 2009, New Zealand's greatest entertainer. The recognition was 3 months late and 50 years coming, and still in the most important ways, incomplete. The voice remains. The tradition remains. The question remains. What does New Zealand owe the man who gave it its voice? The answer is in the files. The answer is in the recordings. The answer is in the careers of the artists who came after him, and in the culture they build on the foundation he laid at a cost that was never fully acknowledged and a scale that was never fully understood, until it was almost too late to say so. Almost. The knighthood came in June. He heard it. He accepted it with the same smile that had been welcoming audiences for 50 years. And 3 months later, in Rotorua, the city that made him, the voice went quiet. The songs did not.
The specific texture of Howard Morrison's live performances, described by people who saw them across different decades and different kinds of venues, had a consistency that is itself remarkable given the span of time over which he performed. There are accounts of Howard Morrison in his 20s, performing with the quartet in Rotorua clubs in the late 1950s, and accounts of Howard Morrison in his 60s, performing at civic events and commemorations and the large national occasions that required someone who could hold an audience of thousands with a microphone and nothing else. And the accounts share a quality, the sense of being directly addressed, of being specifically included, of the performer being entirely present with this audience in this room on this occasion. This is not a common quality. Most performers, even excellent ones, carry with them onto the stage some version of a general audience, the accumulated sense of all the audiences they have played to, which informs the performance, but which also places a slight screen between the performer and the specific people in the room. Howard Morrison appears from the accounts to have been one of those rare performers who could genuinely dissolve that screen, who could walk out under the lights and be fully present with these specific people, reading the room with a precision that allowed him to give exactly what the occasion required. The technical basis of this quality, the specific skills and instincts that produced it, is difficult to describe because it was largely instinctive rather than systematic. He had, by all accounts, an extraordinary memory for people, for faces, for names, for the specific human details that allow a performer to make an audience member feel individually seen rather than part of a collective. He had the comedian's fundamental skill of timing, but exercised at a level of refinement that went beyond the mechanical and into the genuinely musical, the sense of rhythm and pause and release that makes the difference between a joke that lands and one that does not. And he had warmth, genuine, structural, foundational warmth that was not a technique but a quality of character, and that the stage amplified rather than manufactured. These qualities were, in the years of his greatest performances, combined with a voice of considerable natural power.
The voice was the foundation of the career, not only the instrument of the songs, but the carrier of the warmth and the comedy and the cultural content that were the real substance of what he did. It was a voice that could fill a large venue without strain, and could drop to an intimate register in smaller spaces, that could carry comedy and carry emotion with equal facility, and that had a quality of recognizability, of being distinctively, immediately Howard Morrison, that audiences responded to with the particular pleasure audiences take in the familiar voice of someone they have learned to trust. The recordings preserve this voice. They preserve it in the specific acoustic conditions of the studios, and the specific repertoire of the particular sessions, and the specific production choices of the particular era, all of which shape what is available to a listener today. But they preserve enough of what was there to give a clear account of why the voice produced the response it produced, why it filled stadiums, and why it remained viable across decades in which popular music changed beyond recognition. Listen to the recordings of the quartet in their prime, and you hear four young men who have found a way of doing something that had not been done in quite that way before: the integration of Maori musical tradition and contemporary popular forms, and New Zealand comic sensibility into something that was simultaneously all three and reducible to none of them. The balance is precise, the commitment is absolute, and at the center of it is Howard Morrison's voice, which carries the balance and the commitment with an ease that makes the precision invisible. This is what the country was given. This is what walked out onto those stages in the late 1950s and kept walking out onto stages for the next 50 years. This is what the audiences responded to, and what the television audiences watched in their living rooms, and what the younger artists observed from close range and tried to understand well enough to learn from. The country that received this did not always understand fully what it was receiving. It understood it was being entertained. It understood it was being given something that made it feel good, warm and included and seen and amused.
What it was slower to understand, what the knighthood's timing suggests it was much slower to understand, was that it was being given something that was shaping its cultural identity in fundamental ways, and that the person doing the shaping was doing it from a position that was less comfortable and less supported than the warmth of the performances suggested. The warmth was real. The discomfort was also real. Both existed simultaneously in the same performances, and what Howard Morrison achieved was the maintenance of both, without allowing either to compromise the other. The audiences received the warmth. They were entitled to it. It was what the performance offered.
The discomfort was his to carry, and he carried it with the same discipline and the same refusal of public complaint that characterized everything else about his professional life. He carried it for 50 years. He carried it onto stages that had initially been reluctant to have him, and onto television screens that had needed to be persuaded that a Maori entertainer could anchor a mainstream program, and into the rooms where the contracts were signed, and into the conversations with the younger artists who needed to understand what the career would cost as well as what it would give. He carried it, consistently and without apparent difficulty, because the performance required it, and because the performance was what mattered. The knighthood was in June. He died in September. The carrying was finished. The songs were not. New Zealand has, in the years since his death, continued the process of understanding what it received from Howard Morrison and what it owed him. The process is incomplete. It will probably always be incomplete, because the full accounting of what a person like Howard Morrison gives a culture and what a culture owes in return is not the kind of accounting that admits of a final balance. It is the kind that goes on, in the work of the people who carry the tradition forward, and in the honesty of the culture's examination of its own history. What can be said, with the confidence of the historical record, is this: Howard Morrison gave New Zealand its voice. He gave it across 50 years, from a position that the country's social and industrial structures did not make comfortable or equitable, with a generosity and a discipline and a warmth that produced one of the most significant cultural legacies in the country's history.
And the official recognition of what he had given arrived 3 months before he died, after 50 years of giving. That is the story. That is the full story, or as much of it as the records and the memories of the people who were there allow us to tell. The rest, the warmth of the audiences, the laughter in the kitchens, the songs at the rugby matches and the school assemblies, and the quiet evenings when someone put on a record and felt New Zealand feeling like itself. That rest is not in the records. It is in the culture. It is still there. Howard Morrison put it there, and it has not gone. He gave New Zealand its voice. The voice remains. And the full recognition of what that gift cost and what it was worth, that remains too, in the patient and permanent custody of everything he left behind.